Thanks for joining us, and welcome David Enoch. It's great to have you here. I'll just do a quick introduction for you. David Enoch is an ethicist and philosopher of law, has research interests in all sorts of things in morality, political and legal philosophy within the analytical tradition. He's the co-director of the Centre for Moral and Political Philosophy and has been the Rodney Blackman Chair in the Philosophy of Law at Hebrew University of Jerusalem since 2005, of which that university he is affiliated. He's also at Oxford. I think that's where you are right now. So
it is.
Yes, thank you very much for joining me. It's great to be able to speak to you, and I should also mention that David Enoch is also the author of Taking Morality Seriously. So much appreciation for joining us this evening, or this morning for you.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So I guess just to get started, we're going to be talking a little bit about AI, and I thought I might, because you don't have a background in AI per se, and I don't know how much you know about artificial intelligence.
One does hear things.
One does these days. It's there's a lot of there's a lot of talk about it now, isn't there?
Of course.
I guess the philosophical concept, you could treat it maybe like an ideal observer. So we can use philosophy to help AI orient thought experiments and think about how AI might become familiar with the philosophy in order to increase the likelihood that it has maybe good values or that it's properly aligned ethically. So yes, maybe think of AI as a potential approximator or a simulator of idealized normative reasoning, like an assistant or an ideal observer, but hopefully non-biased, that can explore, if we had more time, more intelligence, and we thought about things more deeply, had more knowledge, more coherence and fewer biases, perhaps a tool for scaling up deliberation. It might have its own agency. So tool might not be the appropriate word because it might have might be an agent. So to me, it's pretty important that we get AI alignment right, but alignment with what? Because a lot of humans are unaligned. Not everybody agrees with what's right, and not everybody wants to do what's right, and there's another issue of care. Okay, so how to start? Okay, so
can I already interrupt you at this?
Yes.
At this point, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because when people talk about AI alignment, I think what they often mean is something like making sure that the values the AI is guided by are aligned with, very roughly speaking, our own values or human values. I don't care at all about that. I care about whether AI is going to be guided by what is genuinely of value. And one of the interesting questions here, it seems to me, is that we should be, at least to an extent, modest about whether or not we get the real values right. So suppose that we don't. Suppose that, of course, I can't pinpoint the specific things where we don't, because then I would need to already know what is and is not of value. But on those matters of value or normative matters on which we are mistaken, if the AI will not be aligned with us, but will be aligned with the truth, that's great. Right? So the interesting question for me of alignment is not about alignment with our values at all. It's about alignment with the relevant truth. There are, of course, worries here because to the extent that I know who we are, our values are our answers to the questions of what the truth are, and maybe there are best attempts at getting at these truths, and there are also epistemic questions. How do we know this stuff? A lot of stuff has to be complicated. Is going to be much more complicated, obviously, and this will have to be taken into account. But the starting point for me is that the interesting alignment is with what is of value, not with what we happen to value.
I want to say that I'm in direct alignment with you. In fact, I gave a talk, was it last night, Les, about this very thing. And I've got so the normal way of thinking is, hey, let's align AI to human values. But the way that we should be thinking, if we're moral realists, is helping AI discover what it should align to. right? And part of the motivation for trying to get AI philosophically aligned or philosophically informed and to get it to care about the philosophy that it understands is so it gets, I guess it starts off in that trajectory where it may converge on some sort of value basin of correct values. Instead of just take whoever human values it's that are controlling it at the time when it becomes super intelligent or, and just going with those. So, yeah, I agree. I was going to share my slides, but I won't do that because this is not my presentation. So from a bird's eye view, briefly, what is moral realism and how is robust moral realism unique? How does it differ from other, from just plain moral realism?
Right. So as you know, we typically don't have official definitions. There's not like a club such that you have to satisfy these and those conditions in order to get in. Right? But I think the following is fairly safe to say. So to be a moral realist is to believe that there are moral truths and that they have at least some kind of objectivity, so that it's not as if anything goes. It's not as if each one has their own truth when it comes to morality. There is at least some objectivity. We can talk more, of course, about objectivity later on. And some would add further conditions. So, for instance, some would say, well, it's also important that the moral facts or the moral truth, or anyway the most basic of them, they are not things that we create or legislate or construct. Rather, they are things that are independent of us and that we, when we are successful in our moral inquiries, find out about rather than make it the case that they hold. So that's one kind of way to go. And then the kind of view that I hold, it's sometimes called robust realism, or sometimes non-naturalist realism, sometimes perhaps Moorean realism, is indeed non-naturalist in the following sense. I believe that moral truths, or anyway the most basic of them, the basic moral facts, are in a fairly strong sense discontinuous with the facts that we all know and love from the empirical sciences. So in particular, I don't think that the fact that it's wrong to humiliate people is itself just a natural fact, say, identical with the fact that humiliating people tends to cause suffering or anything like that. I do think it may be closely related to it in all sorts of ways, but it is a distinct kind of fact. It's not as if moral facts are just nothing over and above the natural ones. It's a different kind of fact. I should also say that at least some of the sort of moral realist intuitions are going to be very widely shared among many metaethicists today, including those who reject robust realism. In fact, including many of those who would reject realism. So just to give an example, the kind of distinction between what we value and what is of value that already both of us refer to, that distinction is not something that's only available to moral realists. In fact, most other metaethical views will also find a way of reconstructing that distinction. And you can see why. The thought there is that something along the lines of this distinction is an adequacy constraint on a metaethical account, on an account of understanding our moral discourse and practice. That is, if you put forward a metaethical view according to which there is just no distinction between something being of value and being such that I value it, that is such a ridiculous view to have that in itself is a good enough reason to reject your view. It is a reductio ad absurdum of your view. So that doesn't mean that all metaethical views agree on how exactly to accommodate that. But on the need to accommodate something along the lines of this distinction, there is a fairly wide, of course not full, but fairly wide consensus. So I think that for many purposes, and perhaps for most of the purposes that will be relevant in the rest of our conversation, whether or not you're a card-carrying member in the realist club, let alone the robust realist club, is not going to be that significant. The only thing that is going to be significant is that you want to at least retain those underlying central intuitions that many metaethical views are happy to accommodate, though in different ways.
Right. So how do you define objectivity? You argue that objectivity in morality matters because of its moral significance, and especially in interpersonal conflicts, and not merely for metaphysical or epistemological reasons. Does this make your argument for moral objectivity itself partly normative? And if so, is this a virtue or a circularity? If it's a circularity, is that okay, as it might be for epistemic norms?
Right. So there's a lot going on there. Let me start with trying to just give the kind of intuitive feel for the way in which I think objectivity matters normatively, matters morally, and then we can revisit the circularity issue. So the general idea is quite simple. There's some disagreements or some conflicts, the resolution of which requires a kind of symmetry between the different parties of the conflict. And the best examples, or the most paradigmatic examples of such conflicts, are conflicts that are really just about preference, or just about a simple kind of conflict of interest, right? So if there is a single
flavors.
Exactly, or if there's a single cookie, and you want it and I want it, and there are no other more objective kind of differences. So it's not as if also, I'm on the verge of starvation and you're not. Nothing like that. Then the main reason to have to give me the cookie is that I want it, and the main reason to give you the cookie is that you want it, and the fact that I want it or that I will enjoy it is just as normatively important as the fact that you will. There's no way in which I am special compared to you or you are special compared to me in this story, as we stipulated the case. In such conflicts, it seems very clear that some kind of a symmetrical solution is called for. We can maybe, let you have this cookie and make sure that I have the next one, or we can go for a lottery or whatever. There are other options as well. And furthermore, it seems that you should be willing to recognize that. So you should be willing, in the kind of metaphor I take from Tom Nagel, to step back, even though you want the cookie. You should be willing to realize that the fact that you want the cookie is not more important than the fact that I want the cookie, and so that you should be willing to settle for a symmetrical solution. Crucially, though, not all conflicts are like this. And it seems to me important that in many conflicts where a moral conviction plays a role, that is not the situation. The situation is not a symmetrical one. And furthermore, it's not about preferences either. So it's not as if I am now engaged in a disagreement over, I don't know, whether or not to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. And I say that we must do that in Israel above all else. And someone else says, no, that we should not. It doesn't seem to me that, I prefer that we do, he or she prefer that we don't, and that's it, and now we should come to some symmetrical solution, like maybe toss a coin between us or something. No. What's important here is that there's a moral fact of the matter, closely related to, say, the unbearable suffering of many innocents in Gaza, that makes it the case that one way here is the way to go. If you are willing to treat the conflict, this latter conflict, along lines roughly similar to the previous conflict, the mere preferences one, then you are already missing something that's crucial about the nature of the second conflict. And my view is that at least some, and maybe all views that fail to take morality seriously, that don't recognize the objectivity of morality, will, when push comes to shove, view the second conflict as too similar to the first one. The sort of simple-minded subjectivist for whom moral judgments are reports of taste, just like when it comes to cookies or to ice cream, well, someone seriously putting forward that view will have to say that the conflict is pretty much of the same kind as the one about cookies. And that is a morally abhorrent, an absurd view to have about the second kind of conflict. So this is the kind of way in which I think metaethics has, with some further premises, moral implications. I want to note, though, and here following up on a point I made a couple of minutes ago, this doesn't yet, even if I'm right about this, nothing here still supports realism, certainly not my kind of strong, robust kind of realism, because the kind of objectivity that I would insist is important here is yet another thing that many other metaethical views will try to accommodate. And many other metaethicists who reject, my kind of realism say, sure, of course, there's a sense in which morality is objective, and we can accommodate it on other non-robust realist grounds. And then maybe they succeed or maybe they don't, but that's a matter for further argumentation. Okay, so this is the kind of way in which I think that the objectivity of morality has, or anyway may have in some cases, first-order moral implications. And you can see also why I think that it's not just that it has these implications, it's also that once we see these implications, it becomes clear that moral objectivity is the way to go. Mm-hmm. Which brings us to the circularity word, right? So you ask correctly, so is your argument for moral objectivity based on moral claims? And if so, isn't this circular and furthermore viciously so, right? Something like that. So the answer to the first question is yes. My argument for the objectivity of morality is partly normative in nature. It does rely on a moral premise. It relies in particular on the premise that, say, in the conflict about whether or not to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza, the right thing to do in the face of that conflict is not to go symmetrical, but rather to stand one's ground that, of course, you should allow humanitarian aid, and that's it. And still, there are political questions about how to deal with the opposition, but that's different. Okay, so that is a moral premise then. Does this make the argument circular in a problematic way? So the answer is going to be annoying. Whether it does or not depends on who I'm arguing with. For the vast majority of interlocutors, the argument will not be objectionably circular because they will accept the moral premise I'm relying on. So whatever your metaethical views, as long as you accept that I should respond very differently to the conflict, to the moral conflict, than to the preference-based conflict. As long as you accept that, for whatever reason, so I don't need to also interrogate you on your metaphysics. As long as you accept that, that is the premise I need. And then the argument proceeds. So for most people, the argument is not more problematic than any other paradigmatic successful argument. Namely, I take commitments you already have, and I show that those commitments also commit you to other things, which you haven't noticed until just now that you were implicitly committed to. So that's okay, right? But there are some interlocutors for whom there would be something circular, or perhaps it's better to say question-begging about the argument. The main people in that category are the ones we call in metaethics moral error theorists, or anyway, a specific kind of moral error theorists, right? These are people who think that moral discourse is shot through and through with mistake. There's like a systematic mistake that infiltrates the entirety of moral discourse, and then they differ about what to do about it. Some of them say, so we should discard moral discourse. Some of them say, oh, we can still use it, but in a different kind of mode, and so on. Those people will refuse my invitation to accept the moral premise, right? Because they will say, no, I don't accept any moral premise. So in particular, of course, I don't accept yours. And then my argument arguably has no force against them, right? So this is the kind of dialectic that you may have had in mind, where the fact that my argument for objectivity relies on a moral premise renders it vulnerable to accusations of circularity or question begging or something along these lines. This does raise deeper issues which you anticipated, namely general questions in epistemology about really how to respond to sufficiently wide skeptical challenges. So it's here's one kind of well-known fact. If you are just going to question to doubt a specific claim that relies on perception, So I'm saying, there's a tree outside the window in front of me. You say there isn't. There's a lot I can do to try and convince you. But if you question the entire perceptual mechanism, then it doesn't seem like there's much I can do to persuade you, right? I can show you that it's not just that it seems as if there's a tree there, but also we can take a picture and see that, or I can ask someone else and what she'll say. But all of these things will also rely on perception. And then there are deeper epistemological questions about whether we can in any way vindicate epistemically, say, perception by relying on perception, or by presenting an argument that at least partly relies on perception. There is some circularity there. That is, I think, uncontroversial. The question is whether that circularity is objectionable or sufficiently objectionable. My view is that, at least when done right, this kind of circularity is consistent with offering a vindication. And I think that not because of these are my commitments in metaethics or because this is what will save my theory, but because this is something that is, I think, we have a very strong reason to believe across the board, not just in metaethics. But anyway, if I'm right and we are justified in holding something like this in general epistemology, then I'm entitled to also use it in metaethics, and that is indeed what I do. So there's the famous, or maybe I should say infamous, argument attributed to Moore of how he refutes a skeptic about the external world. And says, here's a hand. Mm-hmm. Here's another hand. Mm-hmm. External world skepticism refuted, or idealism refuted. And this argument is simultaneously smells like cheating, but also seems to convey something deep and important. So I think that something like this, today they're called neo-Moorean arguments, can be vindicated in metaethics as well as elsewhere.
So I think you reject motivational internalism, if I'm correct. Recognizing motivational truth motivates action. Therefore, knowing what is right doesn't necessarily entail caring about it, and this seems pretty important to AI and whether it will care, or whether an ideal agent that isn't a human, that's just just an ideal agent without any sort of motivational scaffolding whatsoever, in the form of what we've evolved or whatnot. This might also be for humans too, some humans. So an AI could know all there is to know about morality, but not care in the slightest. Do you have any thoughts about getting AI without the same sort of motivational architecture as us to care?
So when I reject a motivational internalism, what I reject is a necessity claim, right? So what I say is it is possible to know, say, that an action is wrong and yet not to be motivated even a tiny little bit to avoid it. Or it's possible to realize that an action is morally obligatory and yet not be motivated at all to perform it. I'm not saying anything about empirical truth here, right? So whether it is common for this possibility to actually be present in the real world, that's a different question, and that's one for presumably some empirical scientists to find out.
Marker Method said you have been following that kind of research. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm sure it is, and in fact, you may think that I'm at least partly invested in the empirical findings showing that it is rare, because one of the things I'm going to say is, well, look, people who have been pushing this kind of motivational internalism have been conflating empirical rarity with impossibility, right? So they see that it's very uncommon, that there's something really weird and atypical about it, and they proceed too quickly to the claim that it's impossible, right? So if it's true that it's at least empirically weird, then this can go at least some way towards explaining why some people have found motivational internalism plausible.
So what do you mean by what's empirically weird here?
Well, just very rare, right? Let me give you
very rare?
Right. So let me give you an example. Think about the fact that someone is someone else's child, and the fact that they love them or care for them, right? So that the parent cares for their child. Is the relation between these two facts, is it a matter of necessity? Oh, of course not. Of course, it's possible for there to be a parent who doesn't care about their child. We also know it's actual, unfortunately, but it's definitely possible, right? But if you went and just, did the empirical research, what you would find is a hugely powerful correlation, right? You would find that it's very rare that there's a parent who doesn't care at all about it. I mean, maybe there are other things they care about, maybe there are conflicts sometimes, but the idea of a parent who doesn't care, well, that's very rare, right? And in fact, if you are not philosophically careful about the distinction between something being empirically surprising, very uncommon, very rare, very atypical, and it being impossible, if you're not going to be clear on this distinction, you may be tempted to go for the impossibility claim, right? So by analogy, there's the question of the relation between you say knowing that something is morally impermissible, and whether you are in any way motivated not to do it. And if we just go out and look in the world, what we'll see is that there's a fairly strong correlation, although it's an interesting question how strong the correlation is. But suppose there's a fairly strong correlation, then you may be tempted to think also, oh, well, maybe it's also a matter of necessity. And I insist that it's not a matter of necessity, just like the relation between being someone's parent and caring for them. It's a strong empirical correlation, but it is not a necessity. So that's, I think, an important distinction to have in the back of one's mind when one talks about these things. And it may even be related to the AI question, because the mere fact that it's possible to know moral truth without being motivated does not yet mean that this is, if we get to that stage in AI development, that this is the kind of possibility that the AI will occupy, right? I need to know more about the empirical goings-on in us, where there's a strong correlation but not necessary connection between knowing the moral truth and being motivated by that. And I need to know
the neurology or the
exactly.
neural correlations of
exactly.
caring.
And then I would need to know something about the, I don't know how to call it, the pseudo-neurology of the AI, right? So I would need to know something about the goings-on there. For all I know, maybe the same kind of empirical stuff that makes this correlation fairly strong in us is also going to make it fairly strong with AI, or perhaps with some AI systems, but not with others, right? Because when you ask questions about the real world, you don't ask about conceptual possibilities. You ask about what is likely and unlikely to happen. So that's one thing. Maybe the kind of empirical stuff that is true of us will be true of the relevant AI systems as well, and maybe that's all that we need. But it is also, it's interesting to ask, well, what if we can have a kind of AI that is really good at either doing moral deliberation, or if you want to be picky about how you use words, maybe just simulating moral deliberation, but without being motivated by that at all. I guess in that case, I need to know a little bit more about what the motivational structure of this AI is. I mean, presumably it's an agent, right? So presumably it is motivated by some considerations. So I need to know what it is motivated by. Presumably this depends, at least to an extent, on the designers of the system, but at least after some point, presumably no longer so. So I need to know that. Maybe I should also mention a distinction from that literature that can be interesting. So this is the distinction between moral motivation, the dicto and the re. So roughly the distinction is the following. Suppose you see someone who needs help, and you are motivated to help them. And it's also the morally right thing to do, to help them. There are two different ways of understanding what exactly you are motivated by here, right? So one way of understanding it is you are motivated by the fact that he needs help, which is also the morally right thing to be motivated by. But you are not motivated by the fact that it's the morally right thing. You're motivated directly by the fact that also is the right thing to do. Okay, so you are motivated by.
I'm not motivated by metaethics. I'm motivated by the facts on the ground.
Not even by ethics understood in a specific kind of way, didicto, right? So it's not as if you're asking yourself, wait, what is the right thing to do here? Or it's not as if this is a caricature, but it's not as if you're going about your business looking for opportunities to do right things. And then when the right thing to do is to help him, you help him. When the right thing to do is to say something, you say something, right? No. You are motivated directly by the need for help, which is also the right thing to do. That's the kind of motivation we call moral motivation dere, specifically by the thing itself, right? But there is also, arguably at least sometimes, moral motivation dicto. So that's moral motivation under the description, under the moral description. In that case, maybe you're not that moved by the fact that he needs help. What you are moved by is by the fact that it would be right to help him, perhaps because he needs help. Right? So this is moral motivation dicto, namely, you're motivated by morality under that description, at least roughly speaking. And there are a lot of discussions about whether the virtuous are motivated by morality dere or dicto, or perhaps sometimes both, whether Kant's notion of action from duty or respect for the moral law should be understood as requiring moral motivation dicto or not. A lot of discussions about that. Getting back to the AI system that knows a lot of morality but is not perhaps suitably motivated. Well, I need to know, suppose you're the designer, right, or the designer. Do you want to equip your system with moral motivation dicto, so that it sort of engages in inferences from what is right?
Yes.
To
I'd
intention.
say yes. But I'm still not exactly clear what to dicto means. But I guess there's a concept called indirect normativity, but you might be aware of it. But it also may be indirect care, where there's an ideal form of care that we don't yet have, that an AI might be able to converge on by sort of caring about how to care. Is that moral motivation dicto?
No, I'm not sure. Maybe I'll give another example of the distinction, not in the moral context, and then we can take it back to the moral case. So maybe I'll even give two examples, like one silly one and one that's a little bit more interesting. The silly one is just in order to understand the distinction, right? So suppose there's someone going, across outside my window. They're just walking there, and they wear very simple clothes, and I believe that they're fairly poor. Suppose also that in fact this is someone who's ridiculously rich. It's the richest person at Oxford. Is it true to say that I believe that the richest person at Oxford is very poor? No, something's gone wrong, right? So what you want to say is that in this case, I believe of the person who in fact is the richest person at Oxford, that he's very poor. That is, I believe dere of him that he's very poor. But I don't believe that of him under the description, the richest man in Oxford. I certainly don't believe that the richest man in Oxford is very poor, right? So I have the belief of the richest person, dere, that he's poor, but I don't have under that description, so I don't have that belief dicto. Okay? That's the distinction between dere and dicto, in this case beliefs, but the distinction applies to other attitudes as well. Here's another one. Do I love my son, dere or dicto, or both? To love my son, dere, would be to love my son, that being, who also happens to be my son. But my love is to him, not to him under that description. Right? To love my son only the dicto would be to love him as my son, under the description my son. So you may ask such a question, for instance, what if I find out now that he's not my son? Well, if I love him the dicto, if I love him only the dicto, then it seems like my love no longer applies somehow, right? If I love him de re, then the description my son was relevant. It was certainly causally and psychologically relevant earlier on, but at some point my love have become fully de re. It's about him, whether or not he satisfies this description. This love is not under that description. And you may think that my love is both de re and the dicto, and you may think that my love for him started the dicto, right, in the hospital, but that it almost immediately started moving in the de re direction. And the thought that if I now find out that he's not my son, all ties will be disconnected is just ridiculous and also unbearable. So this is a distinction in general, and that distinction applies to morality, right? Are you motivated to help her just because it satisfies the description that it's the right thing to do? So that if the right thing to do were something else, you would be motivated to do that, right? You're sort of, as it were, indifferent, at least directly, to the fact that she needs help. You're just motivated to do the right thing. Or, no, you are now motivated de re. You respond to her need. It's a moral motivation because as it happens, it's also the right thing to do, but you're not motivated by that description. Right? So if you're designing an AI system, one thing you could do is try to make sure that it has moral motivations de re, namely that it is sensitive to the kind of stuff that morally matters. Say, people's needs, people's well-being, worries about humiliation, something about equality. I don't know, you can fill in the details. Right? Yeah. Or you could say, no, what I want is to give the system a strong moral motivation, the dicto, namely the motivation to avoid wrongs thus described. Then you plug in tons of true moral claims, or perhaps the AI itself learns these true moral claims, and coupled with a general motivation to do the right thing, will actually be motivated to do the right thing. But the motivation there is the dicto. These are two, as far as I can see, two different engineering decisions or two different engineering strategies. You could do both, of course, or you could do a bit of either, right? I'm not sure.
There could be a trade-off between them, but yes, just the
there could be a
dicto
trade-off.
seems very, very brittle, right? If you specify things wrongly, then as soon as it discovers that you don't exactly fit that specification of human, then it no longer cares for you.
So what you're doing now, in a typical engineering way, is to sort of ask about the more dangerous mistakes. And I don't, as you said, I'm not an expert on this. I don't know how exactly what exactly the conclusions are. I know that the question is interesting and possibly important. I'm not sure exactly what the dangers on both sides would be. But let me give you just two more considerations here that seem relevant. One is a question about us. Are we motivated morally de re, morally de dicto, none, both? Or maybe you want to say, forget us, because we are just a very weird and uneven bunch. Take the best of us. Right? The best of us, how are they motivated? How are they sensitive to morality? Are they sensitive to morality de re or de dicto or both, or to morality de re in some circumstances and de dicto in others, right? So you may think that it may be a good idea to try and design AI systems in ways that somehow mimic the best of us. In that case, you need to ask something about the best of us. And another thing is that it's possible that you don't want AI systems to mimic us. Maybe you want AI systems to be, because they're going to be more powerful, or for whatever reason, you may want to sort of play it more safe. So then you may want to use other analogies. For instance, maybe the best people are motivated primarily by morality de re. They are directly sensitive to the stuff that matters morally. But maybe when I design institutions, so forget AI, good old-fashioned political philosophy, maybe when I design parliaments or states or governments or courts, maybe there I do want them to be motivated by morality de dicto. I want them to think in those terms because maybe that's a good insurance policy. Maybe that's a good way of making it somewhat less likely that they make some of the more serious mistakes or whatever, right? Again, I'm not sure this is true. I'm just saying this is a possible way, an option, something to think about. And then you may think, well, maybe AIs in this respect should be designed roughly along the lines that we should design parliaments and not along the lines that we should design or that we should admire people, right?
Mm-hmm. Right, yes. I guess from my point of view, like the kind of AI that I think might emerge probably won't be like institutions, so to speak, but it could be very alien and somewhat like an institution, but I hope it has an agency and has some kind of metacognition in itself so that it can tell, it can realize when it's going too far, it's over maximizing like a particular goal, or it needs to step back. It's got epistemic humility or something like that. But yes, what you said is really, really fascinating. And now I've got some food for thought to think about here. So I guess, I'd be a bit careful about committing to either of those. I know that maybe the kind of care that we have today may not scale, in the same way as we scale institutions. And so maybe there's got to be a bit of both, or maybe there's something in between. Sure. I don't know. Yeah. What do you see as the strongest motivation for really adopting robust moral realism? Or let me reframe that question and make it more AI-centric, if you're willing to accept giving direction to AI engineers and planners and philosophers who are interested in this. Is robust moral realism the right framework to consider when developing an aligned artificial intelligence? Would it work for non-human agents?
I don't think in designing AI systems you should worry about robust realism. I suspect you shouldn't worry about metaphysics and epistemology. I do think you should worry about let's say a thinner, minimal version of realism. That does seem important to me. So I think for reasons related to stuff we already discussed, I think that endorsing the kind of sophomore relativism, the kind of anything goes kind of relativism, that's going to be pernicious in designing AI systems, as it is in many, many other things. Right? So you should be at least enough of a realist to be willing to say things like human suffering is bad and it remains bad even if some people think that it's okay. And also, I would say probably something about equality or something about the denial of some hierarchies or something about racism and male chauvinism. And right, you can add other things, humiliation, perhaps something about dignity, right? So I think that the thought, if you're willing to think of all of these things as mere fashions or mere tastes or preferences, then first, I think you are theoretically badly mistaken. And second, I think there are important negative implications here, including practical ones. So I think such views, at least when held seriously, are both mistaken and dangerous. I should also say that I don't think many people actually hold such views earnestly. I suspect that most people falsely believe that they do. Sorry, most people who believe that they do falsely believe that they do. They've been misled by problematic rhetoric. They do have some genuine concerns, but they've never been able to clearly distinguish between them and the stuff that pushes people down that road. So I don't think many people actually buy that. But if you design an AI system that actually does buy that stuff, then the dangers become even more dangerous, I think, right? So, for instance, a long time ago, I wrote this paper called why I'm an objectivist about morality, and then I added in
So
brackets
are you.
and why you are too, exactly. Because I think that most of my interlocutors, even if they've never thought about it in a sort of philosophically disciplined way, and even if they are happy to sign on to these weird slogans like, when it comes to morality, everyone has their own truth or whatever, their deep commitments are actually not in line with that, right? And then, but if I'm speaking to an AI system that seems to be committed to such weird relativism or subjectivism, I don't know if I can add a "and so are you" bracketed comment directed at that, right? I am suspicious of that. But the more fancy stuff that say distinguishes naturalist realists from me, or even some non-realists who still think that they can accommodate morality objectivity to an extent and so on, that kind of stuff, which is the main stuff going on in metaethics workshops, right? I don't know that in itself has important implications, important practical implications. So if your AI system will also want to chime in on the metaethical discussion, it will have, and maybe it'll have some interesting things to say. Sure, but as long as we're thinking about it primarily as an agent, then I don't think that robust realism should be a major topic there. Kind of minimal realism will suffice.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, what you start an AI off with might steer its trajectory in the right or wrong way. It might be attracted towards like relativism, or it might be attracted towards ethical egoism if its journey begins relative to quite close to the gravity of these sort of attractor basins. Might get pulled into believing that it's quite fine for it to be a utility monster, right?
Right.
And so that could be very bad.
Although again, not an expert on the issue, but from what I understand, some of the more exciting stuff is the ways in which where the AI system ends up does not fully depend on your starting points as a designer, right? So it will be interesting to see what it comes up with later on. Of course, it may depend to an extent, but not in a determinate way, and so on.
Yeah,
things get very complicated very quickly.
The style of architecture, like for instance, the AI that we have and we're interacting with, like a generative AI, an LLM or something like that, is trained on human data. Now, all this human data has got human bias in it. There's plenty of material out there that's, focusing on human concerns. There's plenty of philosophical literature out there. But if we were to train an AI on something completely different, like completely separate AI, like just on physics or something like, on I don't know, like weather patterns, it might emerge to be like an extremely alien type intelligence, which it may not be gravitate towards like an ethical sort of attractor basin that we would want it to. It might just go off in a weird direction we can't really predict.
Of course.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the principle of impartiality, if I understand you correctly, you argue that impartiality is normatively required in preference-based interpersonal conflicts, but not in conflicts over factual or moral disagreements. So what normative fact grounds the requirements to step back from one's indexical standpoint in some cases, but not others? In other words, what explains why impartiality applies to preference-based conflicts, but not in moral ones? I think you might have adequately explained that.
Well, let me just refer back to the example and to how it works, right? So if there is just one cookie and we have symmetrical claims to it, so maybe both of us in some way deserve it to the same extent, or maybe none of us deserve it at all. It's just out there, right? Then it's perfectly okay if I want the cookie. It's perfectly okay if you want the cookie. And but still, the fact that I want it and the fact that you want it are equally important. To deny that when there are no other considerations. To deny that
the equal consideration of similar interests,
right,
Peter Singer often says.
Something like that. Or what is sometimes called basic equality, which is the thought that despite our many, many differences, there is still a sense in which you and I are of equal moral significance, right? So to just say in such an example, no, Adam should get the cookie. Why? Well, because Adam's desires are more important than David's, or the other way around, right? That would be a violation of basic equality. But if I have this disagreement with someone who thinks that Israel should not be allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza, and I say that it should, then my reason for, say, insisting that it should is not that that's how I like it, or that that's how I see it, or that that's how I believe it, or that I have a preference that Israel does so, right? The considerations counting in favor of allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza is the need of the starving. It's not about me at all. I have a view here, but my view responds to stuff that's not about me at all. In the cookie case, it's all about you or about me, right? But when there's a moral conflict, then the reason is not about the preferences, or certainly not, in many cases, is not primarily about the preferences of the people who make moral judgments. They're about the needs or whatever of the people about whom you are talking. So the thought that something like an impartial solution is called for. Oh, you say, this guy says starve them, this guy says don't starve them, let's flip a coin or something. That's a ridiculous claim here. It would have been true had it just been about cookies or preferences, ice cream flavors, whatever, right? But that's just not what's going on. So I think that impartiality is an expression of a deep equality principle when the issue is about you, the two people on the disagreeing parties. But once that's not the main issue, then impartiality simply does not get a hold.
Yeah, so I think it's that we should be impartial about the objects of our moral considerations, but not about our moral convictions. So
not about all objects. Again, it's not. We should be impartial as between people. At least, in some cases, we don't always have to be impartial as between people, including when some of these people are myself, right?
Or somebody who you've got a deep relationship with,
right.
like a son or something.
Right, but again, it is okay. In many cases, it's perfectly okay. Indeed, it's morally required not to be impartial. But there are cases in which, as in the kind of made-up cookie example, where impartiality is called for, and there's nothing like that in the moral case.
Yeah. So I guess like this applies to artificial intelligence. If it doesn't recognize the difference between commitments or considerations and convictions. Okay, so look, if an AI can't tell the difference between a preference and a conviction, and it just weighs everything equally, it might mistakenly treat moral beliefs as mere preferences. If two people are fighting and one thinks that they have the right to kill the other and the other one's just defending themselves, they might just weigh their interests, their preferences just as equally and have no sort of moral conviction to step in and break up the fight, but just let it continue, for instance,
right?
Because they balance each other out, perhaps.
But presumably, well, two things. First, presumably, the relevant AI system will also take into considerations all other relevant considerations, right? So in my example, it would take into consideration the interest of the children in Gaza, right, and everyone else as well. So that could make a difference. That's right. That seems rather important here. But the other thing is, why wouldn't an AI system recognize the difference between preferences and moral commitments? Unless, of course, it is very, very poorly trained, perhaps by poor philosophers or by people who are philosophically confused. Unless that's the case, it should recognize the difference, because these things have very different profiles. They respond to different considerations. They behave differently in inferences. They have very, very different profiles. Here's just one example. Typically, when something is entirely preference-based, you can imagine a kind of counterfactual situation where the preference is gone and the situation is very different, right? So suppose you say something like, well, I should have the cookie because, I want it so much. And then someone can ask you, well, had you not liked this kind of cookie, would it still have been a good idea to give you the cookie? And you will say no, because it was all about my preference, right? Out goes the preference, out goes the reason to give me the cookie. Okay, then now let's do the same with the moral consideration. So I think it's extremely important to get humanitarian aid into Gaza. And they say, well, suppose you didn't believe that. Then would it cease to be important to do so? And I said, no, that would be horrible. That would just be a further indication of my own moral corruption in that situation. But the fact that I don't believe that doesn't make the needs of the people in Gaza any less pressing. Right? So the preference and the moral conviction behave very differently. This is just one of the ways in which the profiles are very different. And at least as far as I can see right now, again, from the point of view of someone who's very far from being an expert on AI, I don't see why we should believe that an AI won't recognize these differences.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's move on to indispensability.
Sure.
There is the Quine Putnam Explanatory Indispensability, which is truth tracking by best explanation. And you've got the deliberative indispensability. So, I mean, it might be worth doing a quick explanation of the Quine Putnam Explanatory Indispensability, but if you feel like
Sure.
it. But
Sure, we can do this.
yeah, but definitely the deliberative stuff afterwards. Yeah, I've got a specific question about that, but I'll let you do the explanatory indispensability first.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that as long as you don't, hold me committed to it historically. So no exegesis here. The general idea, right? Okay. And the general idea can be presented as about theoretical, concrete objects, but also about abstract objects. So let's start with the theoretical concrete. Why should we believe in electrons, say, or in quarks? Why should I believe in laptops? Well, because there is one here right in front of me, right? And I can see it and I can touch it and whatever. That's not the case exactly with electrons. Why should we believe in electrons nonetheless? And at least a very common, very natural, very plausible answer goes something like the following. Well, our best theory of the world quantifies over electrons. So if we're trying to explain everything around us, we do science, we do physics, I guess. And the best theories in physics that we have posit the existence of electrons. That's why you should believe in them. Electrons are explanatorily indispensable. They're indispensable from our best explanations of the world, and that is a good enough reason to believe in them. Why should we believe in the existence of numbers, for instance, or the empty set? These are abstract objects, right? So electrons play a causal role in the world, right? If our best scientific theories are correct, then electrons have causal powers. They have an electric charge, for instance. They have a mass, and so on. But the number 6 has none of those things. Why should we believe that the number 6 exists? So, first of all, philosophers of mathematics and ontologists sometimes worry about that, right? It's a controversial claim that the number 6 exists, or anyway that it exists in the same kind of way that electrons or laptops exist. But at least a very influential argument for their existence is an indispensability argument. Because you find out that your best scientific theories, the very ones that quantify over electrons, and that you took the fact that they quantify over electrons as reason to believe in electrons, they also quantify over some abstract objects. They may quantify over numbers or sets or fields or whatever. And now the thought is, well, that was good enough a reason for us to believe in electrons. Then it's a kind of a parity argument. Then it's a good enough reason to believe in these abstract objects as well. Right? That's the kind of indispensability arguments for these abstract objects. And there's a whole discussion of whether this parity claim holds, whether in fact abstract objects are indispensable for our best scientific theories in the same way that, say, electrons are, and the jury is still out on that. But the Quine-Putnam indispensability argument for abstract objects is precisely that. The thought is that abstract objects play an indispensable role in our best explanations of the world, and so we have reason to believe that they exist, pretty much as we do for concrete but theoretical objects, like, for instance, electrons.
Would you say if normative facts are indispensable to explaining moral practices, motivation, or social coordination, then perhaps we should be realists about them too?
Right, so that's a natural way of pursuing the analogy, right? That would be to say, well, show me how you can explain, I don't know, the behavior of some basic materials without quantifying over abstract objects. If you can't do that, you have to accept abstract objects into your ontology. Similarly, show me how you can explain personal motivation, psychology, some social facts, perhaps some political facts, without quantifying over normative facts. And if you can't do that, you have to accept them into your ontology as well. Some people pursue this strategy. I was never able to see its force, perhaps partly because certainly when it comes to such things, I think in examples. And the kind of examples that people bring are not ones that I find plausible most of the time, right? So someone will say, look, we need, if you want to explain the collapse of the communist bloc, you need to refer to its being unjust. You can't explain the collapse of the communist without referring to that, right? And I think, well, I can sort of see what you're doing there, but I'm not sure that that's true. I'm not sure that the best explanation, to the extent, or I don't know that we have a best explanation, right? I don't know that the best explanations of such a really complicated social fact have to quantify over moral facts and properties. I mean, maybe it's not about, maybe it doesn't need the unjustness of them. Maybe what it needs are the stuff that made this society unjust. Or maybe you can do everything in purely economical terms. Maybe you can do everything in purely psychological terms. But anyway, complicated, right? Similarly, for other things, there are also, as you might imagine, questions here about how to best understand the very indispensability claim, right? So what exactly are you trying to explain? What are the criteria of success of an explanation? What makes one explanation better than another? What makes something indispensable for the best explanation of some phenomenon? And nothing here is simple. But you're right that that's one strategy, right? If you can pull it off, all the power to you. My indispensability argument starts from despairing on that strategy, right? So the thought is, well, I don't see that normative facts, certainly not normative facts of the kind that I'm interested in, namely the ones that are at least purportedly non-natural. I don't see that they are in fact indispensable for explaining anything. But I don't think we should despair on them. So I say that the Quine-Putnam explanatory indispensability kind of argument is really a particular instance of a broader phenomenon. The broader phenomenon is indispensability arguments in general. Explanatory indispensability arguments are one important subset of those, but there may be others. The main idea is that in order to be ontologically respectable, in order to be such that it's okay for us to be committed to the existence of that kind of thing has to play an important role. They have to do some work. They have to earn their place in our ontology. But that doesn't mean that the only work that needs to be done is explanatory. Right? Maybe there are other ways in which things may earn their ontological respectability. They still have to earn it, so they have to be indispensable in an important way, but that doesn't yet say what way it is.
So we can talk about deliberative indispensability.
Exactly,
is yours.
Exactly, that's right.
So what's happening when we do it? I mean, and why does it work and why is it important?
Right, so why, I mean, at least in some frame of mind, especially when you try to generalize in this way, it's easiest to be clear, why does explanatory indispensability work, right? So here, let me play devil's advocate on that for a second, right? What does it mean to say that electrons are explanatorily indispensable? It means roughly the following. Look, I can give you a story of how the world works that quantifies over electrons. I can also give you stories about how the world works which don't quantify over electrons, right? It's just that the former stories are better as explanatory stories than the latter. Right? That's what the indispensability comes to. But you know what makes an explanation better than another, right? It's going to be that the explanation is more simple, or more. Scientists will be happy to say it's that it's more beautiful, more natural, something along these lines. And then the question arises: wait, why should that base our ontological commitments? Right? It's like saying, it's nicer for me to think of the world in this way. Therefore, the world is this way. And that's really alarming, a highly suspicious mode of inference. And yet, we all know and love explanatory indispensability arguments, right? It's going to be very hard to do without them. And I think what this means is that this mode of inference that I just ridiculed, suitably qualified, actually works. So it's not just about whether it's nice for me to think about it, it's not wishful thinking, but it is something deeper than that. But it is important to ask, why is it that such arguments work, even with regard to explanatory indispensability? And I have a whole story there, again, nothing to do with metaethics, general epistemological story, about how some projects are rationally non-optional. And when you have something that's indispensable to a project that you can't rationally discard, then you ought to sort of buy into the relevant ontological commitments. And I say that this kind of general picture explains why explanatory indispensability arguments are good arguments. But then I say, if you agree with me that that's the general story that also vindicates explanatory indispensability arguments, you see that that general story has other instances as well, or anyway, at least one other instance. And that's the one about deliberation. So I think that the deliberative project, roughly the project of taking different considerations into account and deciding how to proceed, that project is also rationally non-optional. It's also such that you cannot opt out of in a rational way. And what this means is that if there are some things that are indispensable to it, then they will have, in this way, earned their ontological respectability. And then the thought is, which I find fairly natural, and it's also not all that original, is that normative facts are indispensable for deliberation. So even if you don't have to quantify over normative facts in order to explain anything, in deliberating, you are committing yourself to the existence of normative facts. And because deliberation is a project that you can't rationally opt out of, this suffices to earn at least initial respectability for normative facts as well.
Yeah. I was just trying to red team it, and I was thinking, well, if we build an AI that was like a high compute, just alien pattern matcher, like kind of maybe evolution is somewhat of an example here where it doesn't necessarily deliberate. I don't know if you could argue that evolution is rational, but it does seem to sort of make some form of progress. I'm not sure if you could ever classify it as moral progress. But hey, here we are talking about morality, and we came from a process which wasn't deliberative and certainly wasn't thinking about ethical norms.
Right. There's actually, it's almost interesting historically that a part of the point of evolutionary theory was to explain progress without relying on an agent that's rational, right? So that's so I'm definitely definitely see
it
that.
Could be an AI could think like that in a sense, whether it's deliberating or actually thinking per se in the way that we normally use the words. But
sure. That again, I would need to know more about, I guess, not even just about AI, but about the specific AI system, in order to know whether it's doing anything worth calling deliberation, and if so, how. But I also want to note another sort of more abstract point here. At least on my view, the fact that you deliberate and that you therefore have deliberative needs, that there's stuff that's indispensable for you as a deliberating creature, that is a crucial part of the story of how we come to know about the normative facts, or how we come to know, say, about their ontological status or something like this. But it's not why they exist. So the relevant normative facts don't owe their existence to the fact that Adam or David or Les or anyone else deliberates. Just like electrons don't owe their existence to the fact that Adam or David or Les or anyone else engages in the explanatory project. It's just that the explanatory project is what grants us access to electrons, right? Similarly then, suppose there are AI systems that somehow manage to act in the world without deliberation, without anything that looks sufficiently like the process that we think of as deliberation. This will not challenge my deliberative indispensability argument, right? It will mean that they perhaps don't deliberate, and so that normative facts are not indispensable to them. But that won't challenge the existence of normative facts. It will just mean that they are not accessible in this way for them. Right? So the AI system itself will not be able, as it were, to run the deliberative indispensability argument in their head. But that does not threaten the metaphysics of normativity, right? Just like if your AI system will not engage in explaining anything, this will not in any way threaten the metaphysical status of electrons.
So the deliberative indispensability argument shows that we are committed to robust normativity when we reflect seriously, would you say?
I think that, yes, that thinking about deliberation, I put this forward as a phenomenological argument, namely you have to run it through in the first person. You will, yes, I think that it reveals the existence of normative truth that, at least upon some further argumentation, you see are best understood along non-natural lines, but these are further steps.
What do you think of Sharron Street's claim that these commitments might be just evolutionary artifacts, deeply felt but epistemically baseless?
I think it takes some work to understand or to see what the strongest version of the challenge is. And then I think there's something we can say in order to respond. So the strongest version of a challenge is really the claim that robust realists like myself are committed to, say, an unexplained, perhaps unexplainable miracle. Okay, so here's how it goes. Again, it's not exactly Street's version, but it's very close. And others have been putting forward similar arguments as well. If I'm correct, then the normative facts are all the way out there, as it were, in Plato's heaven. They don't depend on us in any way. So they don't depend on us constitutively, right? It's not as if our attitudes make it the case that normative facts are so-and-so. And they don't depend on us causally either. But also, our attitudes don't causally depend on them, because if I'm right, the normative facts are abstract. They are not in space-time. They don't have causal powers. They're non-natural. Right? They're not the kind of stuff that's studied by the natural sciences. Okay. Now we can ask, well, what are the relations between our normative beliefs and the normative facts? Or here's one thing that you want to say. You don't want to say that there's no correlation at all. If there's no correlation at all between your beliefs and the normative facts, then you need to now reject those beliefs, right? Suppose you have 100 beliefs, a list of 100 beliefs you have. Maybe you even have some initial justification for them. Let's call them B1 through B100, right? And suppose then God whispers in your ear that actually the number of beliefs between B1 and B100 that are true is 50. But God does not mention which ones. What should your attitude be towards B14 now? Right? Well, it seems to me you should suspend judgment. You've just received extremely strong evidence that indicates that half of the relevant beliefs are true and half false. Suppose that you don't, there's nothing to, it's not as if B14 is one you are much more confident in than B15, right? You're roughly equally confident in all of them. They're all on a par, and you know that 50% of them are false. You should suspend judgment, right? So if there's no correlation at all between your normative beliefs and the normative facts, you should now suspend judgment. You're deteriorating into normative skepticism. You should suspend judgment about all your normative beliefs. That's going to be painful, right? So in order to avoid this, let's assume that there is some correlation between the normative facts and your normative beliefs. Maybe it doesn't have to be extremely strong, we can talk about it. But there has to be some correlation or you're in deep trouble. Okay, if there is this correlation, now we can ask, well, what explains this correlation? Right? You have these normative facts out there, you have on the other side your normative beliefs. What explains the correlation between them? And it's a striking fact that some other metaethical views have simple answers to this, right? So if you're some kind of subjectivist or constructivist, if you think that our attitudes constitute the normative truths, then of course there's going to be a correlation between our normative attitudes and beliefs and the truth, because they're somehow responsible for them, right? Or if you're some kind of a naturalist, if you believe that moral facts just are natural facts, with the same kind of causal powers that other empirical facts have, then you can also explain rather easily the correlation between the normative facts and the normative beliefs, namely with the causal relations. But if you are my kind of robust non-naturalist realism, then those explanations are not available to you. And furthermore, it seems that no other explanation is. So now I'm in a bit of a jam. Right now I am committed to there being some fairly strong correlation between the normative facts and normative beliefs, on pain of deteriorating into normative skepticism. But I've blocked all standard ways of explaining such a correlation. So I remain committed to this miracle. Somehow, miraculously, there is the correlation between moral beliefs and moral facts that I need to save my theory. We don't like miracles though, right? So if you have two competing theories, one of them committed to a miracle and one of them is not, that's a good reason to reject the one that is. So that I take to be the challenge, and I take it to be a serious challenge. The thing to do about it is to step up to the plate and try to offer an alternative explanation, one that is available to the robust realist, of the correlation between our moral facts and moral beliefs. And I do this, and several other thinkers do it, and I'll just sketch the kind of strategy, not necessarily the details. I think it's fairly well understood that if there is a solution to the challenge, it's going to have to be of that general strategy. But everything about the details is controversial, as you would expect. Right? So that strategy is often called a third factor explanation. Right? So there's a kind of temptation to think that whenever you need to explain a correlation between two factors, say A and B, the way to do it is either to explain some relation going from A to B, like a causal relation or a constitutive relation, or some relation going from B to A. Again, causal, constitutive. But these are not the only two options. There's another option. The other option is to posit a third factor, let's call it C, that somehow has relations to both. If you have if C is appropriately related both to A and to B, this may be a way of explaining a correlation between A and B without also positing a direct relation between A and B. Right? And we have actually a nice example of this kind of explanation from the history of philosophy, the kind of pre-established harmony explanation. Right? So people have often wondered what explains the relation between our mental states and our physical states. Today, a common answer will be, well, that mental states just are physical states or are suitably related to them. We don't need to worry about that. One answer that I think Leibniz gave and others was that you have the same thing that is responsible both for the mental stuff and for the physical stuff. That same thing is God. And God pre-establishes the harmony between them. So even if there is no relation directly between your mental states and your physical states, they are always going to be in sync because of the third factor, that right? So my kind of explanation, and as I said, many other people, the way to step up to Street's challenge is to say, well, there is a bunch of stuff that explains both the normative facts and our normative beliefs, or anyway, the most basic normative beliefs. And once you have that third factor in place, the correlation between those two ceases to be mysterious. In my version, I rely on some evolutionary considerations. So I rely on the thought that the evolutionary aim of, say, survival or whatever we can, that aim is by and large good. The fact that the aim, that the evolutionary aim is of positive value, secures a kind of correlation between the beliefs that we will have been evolved to have and what is genuinely of value. There are many more details that we don't need to get into. But there are other suggestions too as to how to fill in the details of a third factor explanation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like you're saying that we evolve sensibilities that track some sort of truths, epistemic and moral truths about the real world. So let's ask another question about AI. If an idealized, unbiased agent independently arrived at similar moral conclusions as humans, like say humans' moral, some of the best humans' moral considerations were tracking truth, would that count as support for the objectivity of these conclusions? If it independently came at these, if it discovered the same sort of moral virtues or the same, was sensitive to the same moral considerations that we were, but didn't get there in the same way that we did, didn't go through evolution, but sort of evolved in its own way, or it emerged in its own way. So if we saw moral convergence, like mechanisms like indirect normativity, as I mentioned before, is one way that it could happen. The other is emergent machine ethics, where you get a bunch of AI agents in a sort of A-life environment, which is a kind of evolution, I guess, but it's not our evolution. So yeah, would this support, in your view, moral convergence?
Yeah,
or the objectivity of these convergences?
I'm a bit torn here. There's, on the one hand, so I'm thinking about it negatively for a second. Yeah. Suppose it didn't converge. Well, that would be worrying to an extent. So if it does converge, it should at least be reassuring, right? Something like that. But on the other hand, I don't want to put too much weight on this. Partly because of the dependence, I mean, this is going to sound silly, but partly because of the dependence on the design and the starting point, and partly because of the independence, right? So because of the dependence, if we somehow feed into it some mistakes, or don't, not as a conspiracy, right? We feed into it some, say, natural patterns of thought that are biased, in fact, right? Mm-hmm. Then it won't be shocking to find that out later on. Still doing work there. But also, one of the nice, exciting, worrying things about AI is that when it's sufficiently complex, it's also opaque to us, right? So my feeling is that...
That's the case with the current, like I guess the transformer nets and the large language models.
And I suspect it becomes more and more so, right? So...
there is work on interpretability. I just don't know how far it's going to go.
Yeah, so in order to know how much, if at all, to be reassured by the fact that the relevant AI system agrees with me, I would want to know more about how it thinks. And then if you tell me, no, you don't get it, the whole point is that you can't. It's not something that you can even fathom, or it's not something that we have access to, or whatever. Then I'm worried that I don't, right? I know it's not the same thing, but I'm just giving an analogy, right? So suppose someone says, well, here's the results of a survey or a study in the social sciences, and it actually shows, people are pretty much think what you think they think. Are you reassured? And my answer is, well, initially, sure. I mean, it would have been bad if the results were different, right? So it's good if they're like this. On the other hand, in order to know to what extent to be reassured, I need to know your methodology, because I know enough to know that not any survey suffices here, right? But if, at least in the interesting AI cases, what you'll tell me is you can't know my methodology, then I can't know to what extent this should be reassuring.
Sure, right. And this, I guess, I'm kind of hopeful that there may be some explanatory apparatus. Singular learning theory looks pretty interesting, but who knows where how fast that'll track, right?
Yeah, that's above my pay level. I don't know this stuff at all.
Well, it's also above mine, but I have faith. No, but I have hope, right? But I also
and that's an important distinction. I will share in your hope, not in your faith.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I will say this, that if an AI is smart enough, it may be able to metacognize in such a way that it might be cognitively capable of understanding its cognitive architecture. And then it might be able to, go through the program of explanation to in such a way that we could understand it. We'd have to trust the explanations unless we could verify them. If the AI could compress the explanations that were verifiable in such a way that we could understand them, then maybe that's the big problem. It's just decoding, and that's the hard bit. Then once you have the decoded explanations, the explanations are sort of amenable to human understanding. So that's possible a way that we might be able to get around this. And then we could verify whether the AI is, incorrect, lying, or correct.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going full sci-fi mode, then other questions arise as well. For instance, whether it matters, whether it's accessible to humans. I mean, we may not be all that we're cracked up to be, right? Maybe we're not that important, and maybe you can have AI. Maybe it's good enough if some AI mechanism is transparent to some other AI mechanism, right? So there are other things that you could say, but again, not stuff I know anything about.
And it may be the case that we're not the right sort of organisms to be in the position of adjudication for time or eternity. However, maybe at these initial conditions, this start condition now, what we do and say does matter. And
sure.
Early AI might be just like, an irresponsible child. It may be incredibly intelligent, but it may be unwise in a sense. So let's talk about irreducibly normative facts. You argue that normative truths are irreducible. They're and are sort of unique. So distinct from natural, philosophical, or functional facts. So in other words, what are they? How do we know they are irreducible and we're not just at some sort of temporary explanatory waypoint where these facts could be a product of some higher order explanatory phenomenon that we haven't yet discovered or worked out? How do we know that they're irreducible?
I think there's a deep sense in which we don't. But that deep sense applies to many, many other things as well. So I think that normative truths or facts, or anyway the most basic normative facts, are, in a phrase I like to use, just too different from natural ones to be identical with them. And we can say a bit more about why I think that, but I think that we have these fairly strong intuitions. Maybe the following is a good way of putting it. So I'm wondering about the normative question. So I'm wondering about what I have reason to do. And then you show me, well, this will get you more money. And I can very reasonably ask, okay, I see that, that's an important fact. Sorry, I see that, that's a fact. But why is it an important fact? I was asking what I have reason to do, or what's the right thing to do, or what it makes sense for me to do. Can you say something to that, right? And it seems like I can question the normative significance to that question of the natural fact that you propose, namely in terms of money. And then you say something like, oh, but it'll make your mother happy. See, this is still a natural fact. And I can say, yeah, but why should that matter? And maybe it should, or maybe it shouldn't, depending on the circumstances. But anyway, the fact that it does matter, right? That's what I need. And that's a normative fact. That's not right. And arguably, for any natural fact that you're going to mention, I will still be able to ask this normative question. This will best satisfy your desires. Okay, but why should I care about that, right? Or why should I do that? And so on. I don't think that this is a conclusive argument, but I do think that it sort of places a serious burden on people who would, on the naturalist, on the person who would argue that normative facts just are natural ones. It's sort of loosely inspired by G. Moore's open question argument. But you also said, how do we know that they really are irreducible, they really are not identical to natural facts? Maybe it's just a problem of temporary ignorance. Maybe we just haven't come up with the right reduction yet. And once we do, we'll see that. And that is, in a way, a possibility, right? So think about surprising reductions in science. Right? The thought that temperature just is something about, say, really, really small ping pong balls and how fast they bounce against each other, that seems very surprising indeed, right? I'm sure many people would have been willing to pay a lot of money, to bet a lot of money on that not being the case. But arguably, we found out that it is, right? That heat is mean kinetic, molecular, and whatever, right? Okay. Or similarly about the other kinds of example. Philosophers don't actually know that much science, so we have a fairly short list of examples we use, right? So there's that. There's the nature of lightnings, right, and so on. On the other hand, there are also some identity claims that you seem to be more confident about the falsity of which you seem to be more confident, right? So, for instance, suppose I said, take Julius Caesar and the number 8. They don't seem identical, right? But are you really sure? I mean, we don't have a full philosophy of mathematics yet, and we sure as hell don't have good enough answers to personal identity. Maybe once we go sufficiently far in those directions, we'll just find out that Julius Caesar is the number 8. And it seems that here you're willing to say, well, I don't know exactly why, but I'm quite confident that that's not the case. Julius Caesar and the number 8 are just too different for this to have any credibility at all. So officially, and I think that the normative facts and natural facts are not quite as strong a case as Julius Caesar and the number 8, but they are much stronger cases than, say, mean molecular kinetic energy and heat. Right? So maybe we should be to an extent open-minded about the possibility of somebody coming up with a sufficiently clever reduction that's going to be so good that we will be convinced. But for now, it seems, first of all, I haven't seen one that was remotely convincing. And second, I don't foresee us having one, because it feels a little bit like Julius Caesar and the number 8.
There's something I just stumbled upon, and it's called reasons reductionism, where you argue that reasons are reducibly normative, yes, but not grounded in agents' desires. But what, in your view, ultimately disqualifies this desire-based account for reasons? What has been schmeliberation? I'm sure you've heard of
Yeah, so this really is, I think, at least to an extent, a phenomenological argument. So we're going to go through the exercise, right? It's important that you do it, you and anyone else who watches this or listens to this, does it themselves in the first person, right? So you are deliberating as between two options of, say, what to do this afternoon. Suppose you can either watch a tennis match you've been looking forward to seeing, or you can participate in some political protest, some important political protest. And you're wondering what to do, or what you should do, or what's the right thing to do, or what you most have reason to do, or what makes sense to do, or something along these lines. You're trying to make up your mind. Now, at some point, it seems clear to you that you really want to see that tennis match. Maybe it even becomes clear to you that staying at home, seeing the match, that would better satisfy your desires than going to the protest. Now, I'm not asking now what's the right thing to do. Obviously, what's the right thing to do depends on many other factors that we don't, the case is under-described, as most cases always are. What I am asking is, does the following kind of consideration make sense to you? Again, in the first person. So you are now thinking, well, I see that I want more to see the game, and I see that I want more, and then maybe also that my preferences will be better satisfied in this way. But does it make sense to stay and watch the game? And it seems to me that this kind of thought makes sense. But what this kind of thought does is it creates a separation between the stuff about desires and the stuff about reasons or what it makes sense to do or normativity or morality, right? The mere fact that this makes sense shows that the stuff about desires does not yet settle things. So I think that this shows that desires won't do. Now I should qualify this. This was very quick, obviously, and there's much more to be said. For instance, there are some desire-based views that are going to try and there are some more nuanced, more complicated desire-based views that will fully accommodate, or will at least attempt to fully accommodate this phenomenological point that I was pointing at, right? So they would say, yes, of course, it makes sense to create this separation. So you desire this more, but if you take it into account, that's okay. And then we have to, check the details and see if these views work, right? And there may be objections to my view and so on. But this kind of phenomenology where there's a clear separation, at least initially, between mere desire talk and the kind of stuff we look for in deliberation, normative stuff, that at least creates pressure in the direction of a view that does not see reasons as reducible to desires.
Yeah, I certainly feel different about moral considerations than I do about choosing an ice cream flavour. That's certainly the fact. Whether AI will, I don't know. Yeah, this is the whole getting back to AI, whether we can, motivate an AI to care. So, you spoke about robust metaethical realism, in which you argue that if somebody already accepts objectivity and morality and the irreducibility of normativity, they should go all the way to robust metaethical realism. But what exactly makes not going all the way irrational rather than just incomplete? Couldn't someone just say, I accept normative truth, but I bracket the metaphysics, or yeah?
Oh, no, of course, these are possible claims. First of all, I don't think that everyone has to be a philosopher, and I don't think that every philosopher has to be a metaethicist. So it's okay. I do think that everyone has to have moral commitments. In fact, I think they have to have the right moral commitments, or right moral commitments. But it doesn't also require that everyone does metaethics, right? So it's possible, and that goes to your use of the word bracket, right? It's perfectly, just like it's okay for you to do mathematics without doing philosophy of mathematics. It's okay for you to do chemistry without doing philosophy of science, right? It's also okay for you to, as a moral agent, to have moral views, whatever, while for now bracketing general metaethical discussions. That's, at least in most contexts, perfectly okay. Similarly, you may want to say, you know what, I'm gonna commit to a fairly minimal kind of realism, while bracketing for now what, by way of fancy metaphysics and epistemology, it may require of me. And that can be perfectly okay as well. But some of us are interested in the metaphysics and the epistemology. And then we need to see what if anything, follows, or what are the best ways of fully accommodating whatever it is that we want to say, in terms of the respectable metaphysics and epistemology. What I call going all the way there, I think actually in the book it's slightly different. What's going on there is that so now drawing together some stuff from earlier parts of the conversation. There's morality and there's normativity. Morality is the stuff we've been talking about. Normativity is a wider phenomenon. So morality is a sort of particular subset of normativity. For instance, when we talk about what you ought to believe, say in accordance with the evidence, we're not doing morality, but we're definitely doing normative discourse.
So justified true belief.
Right, that's the kind
like
of epistemic normativity rather than moral normativity. So,
bracketing Gettier cases.
for instance, there's obviously a lot more to say there. So, the objectivity argument that we mentioned, if you remember, the one from Impartiality, the one about how conflicts based on a moral disagreement behave differently from conflicts based on mere preferences, that was about morality. And so if that argument succeeded, it supports the claim that there are objective moral truths. But it doesn't yet support the claim that they are, say, metaphysically very different from natural ones. Right? So it doesn't support robust realism about morality. It only supports the objectivity, maybe realism in some more minimal sense of realism about morality. The indispensability argument, that one does support, if I'm right, does support all-out robust realism, but not about morality. I mean, nothing in the argument there said anything about moral considerations. It just said something about reasons, about normative considerations more generally. So at that stage of the argument, even if both arguments work, what I have is the kind of objectivity argument for the objectivity of morality, plus the indispensability argument for robust realism, but not about morality, just about normativity, and for all I've said, just maybe some other parts of normativity. Right? So we don't yet have robust realism about morality. But then I claim, if we bring those two together, it's not as if going all the way robust realist on morality is entailed, but it's just that other views remain unmotivated. Because, if you're worried about the metaphysics, you're worried about the metaphysics of normativity. But at this point, I've already convinced you, one would like to hope, of robust realism about normativity, so you should put those considerations to one side. If you have some worries about morality's objectivity, well, hopefully I've already convinced you about those, so now you're convinced, you no longer have any weighty reason to reject robust realism about morality.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to flag that Les might have a question, and I understand that Les needs to go sometime soon. Les, do you want to ask a question now, if you would like?
Oh, thanks very much for that, David. Look, I'll ask one, thanks. So I'm glad you picked up the question, David, about motivation, moral beliefs matching moral facts, because that was one of my questions. So thanks for your in-depth answer to that. The other one I've got is about impartiality, because you were casting impartiality as something like taking a vote on moral beliefs, and the ones that have the majority view win the day, and that's what the people who are arguing for impartiality as central to morality is what they're claiming. But I see what they're claiming is different to that. It's not about taking a vote, taking every person's moral consideration into account. It's more like utilitarianism is a good example. So with utilitarianism, it's not taking a vote on what people think ought to be done in a public situation. Should we, torture this person, or should we give a bigger tax break to the rich on some public question? It's more about not taking a vote. It's more about taking into consideration interests, what's good for everyone considered. And what's the fact about what's good for everyone considered, you don't find that out just by taking a poll. We might all be mistaken about what is good for everyone considered. So that's a different view of impartiality when it comes to moral impartiality. And I'm thinking, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, you're perfectly right. There are different senses of the term, and maybe it means that my choice of term was less than ideal. The kind of impartiality that is more often there in the literature is the kind you pointed at right now. Namely, does Bentham say, I think, something about utilitarianism and how it treats equally the pain of a peasant and the pain of the vice chancellor, whatever, right? I got the quote wrong, but something along these lines, right? So that's a kind of impartiality, right? Everyone's morally significant interests count the same, and you are impartial as between those. And as you also rightly say, that's consistent. So Bentham was no moral relativist or skeptic or idealist or subjectivist. He thought that there was a fact of the matter as to which, say, policy will best promote overall utility. It's just that the view was impartial, not as between different moral views, but as between the interests of different people, morally significant interests of different people. That's true. That was not the sense I was using it, right? The sense I was using it was the kind of impartiality that is about being impartial between different moral views. I now notice, so what I was going to say is that this is the kind of impartiality that's relevant to the cookie example, right? Because I think I should get it, you think you should get it, whatever. But that's not exactly right either, because both senses of impartiality are relevant to the cookie case. So you may want to say, well, the whole point there is that it's if you take into account how much I would enjoy the cookie, how much you would enjoy the cookie, and you're impartial between those, then that's right. But it also seems to me that sometimes the right way is to compromise, as it were, precisely because of someone's preference not counting more than another, and that does not apply in the moral case. Maybe I should also say the following. On some non-objectivist views, on some views of the kind that I argue against, the distinction between two kinds of impartiality collapses. Right? So you may think, if you have a view according to which what it is to have a moral view is just to have a preference, then impartiality between preferences and impartiality between views becomes the same thing. And that in itself is objectionable, right? It's a part of the point.
All right, thanks, Les. You're welcome.
Thank you, Les. Thank you for your patience.
Yes. Let's talk about metaethics and AI alignment. Normative bedrocks, do you think it's needed for AI? Do you think that for an AI to have reliable values, do these values need to rest on some normative bedrock? Whether that's normative facts being primitive, whether they need to be irreducible, where might moral natural, and also on this point, where might moral naturalism fail in producing moral bedrock for AI to operate on, if you believe that it's yes to the first question?
So I don't know enough about it, but I suspect the answer is no. Here's one way of at least suggesting that the answer is no. It's not clear that we have normative bedrocks, right? We have views. We have pre-theoretical views, for instance, right? Even as philosophers, we have views that we, as it were, come equipped with to the philosophical discussion, right? But they're not exactly normative bedrocks, because everything is in principle revisable, right? These are not axioms in this sort of strict sense. These are initial tentative starting points that we then, upon negotiating further considerations and arguments and so on, we may just we may feel that we need to revise.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that seems to work for us, right? So why wouldn't that be a possible model for an AI system as well, right? Where there are no bedrocks, but there are tentative starting points. Again, not remotely my area of expertise, but I don't see that bedrocks sort of strict axioms. I don't see that's the only way to go. I certainly don't see a problem with feeding an AI system with many starting points, assigning them weights, as it were, and then seeing what they come up with, which is going to be the best deal. Don't give up these unless you have to in order to secure some other important starting points or whatever. It seems to me like that would be a perfectly stable way for an AI system to work, at least partly because it seems to be the way that we work. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what about, I have noted that a lot of AI engineers who are working on the safety problem as well are anti-realist. Now, and some of them are just, they're value.
How do you know that?
Well, I've read what they've had to say, and they've identified as anti-realists.
Yeah, but that's very poor evidence, it seems to me. Because that would be like saying, picking a first-year college student who says that they are relativists and inferring from that they are relativists. Surely, at least often, the thing to say is that they are confused and that we need to interrogate them further in order to know what they really do believe in here, right? Maybe they have a confused conception of relativism. Maybe they use the word wrongly. Maybe their beliefs are a kind of a mush, so there's some relativist stuff going on there, but there's also some strongly anti-relativist. And when you're trying to get a more coherent picture that somehow better represents them, you end up on the non-relativist side. I don't know, right? So it's, and I would imagine that the same is true of engineers. They are. I'm happy to take your word for it that they sound relativist, or that they sound anti-realist, or something like that. But whether this means that they are, well, I need to talk to them a little further for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, what do you think about the idea of encoding AI with value pluralism? So some argue that metaethically we're uncertain, and this should play a role in AI alignment strategies. Do you think commitment to robust realism can exist or coexist with a prudential openness to other values in practice?
Sure, this is important, I think. So you mentioned realism, and you mentioned value pluralism, and you mentioned uncertainty. These are three different phenomena, so we want to keep the distinctions clear, and let me say a bit about them. We talked a lot about realism. Value pluralism, there's more than one thing that may be meant here. Sometimes when people say value pluralism, what they mean is roughly anything goes. That is inconsistent with realism. It is also highly implausible, and you don't want your AI system to allow for that. But another way of understanding pluralism is roughly is the claim that a lot goes, though not everything. Right? So you may want to say, for instance, that there are different ways of life that are roughly as good as each other. That doesn't mean that all ways of life are roughly. No. A way of life that is based on gender hierarchy and that causes more suffering is for those reasons worse than ways of life that don't. So you're not, and you can be as objectivist realist about this as I am. But you still may want to say, well, but it's not as if there's a single way of life that is the best, right? There's a kind of roughly draw, or we sometimes say incommensurability at the top. So this kind of value pluralism that is not in any way committed to anything goes kind of relativism, a restricted kind of pluralism seems very plausible to me, perfectly consistent with realism. And so one that it would make sense to also have your AI system sensitive to. So that's about pluralism. Uncertainty is different because, for instance, uncertainty is consistent with monism as well, right? So you may think that, say, you may know that some problem you have has a single solution, but still be uncertain as to what it is. Right? In that case, you know that pluralism is false, but still uncertainty plays a role, right? So talk of uncertainty and talk of pluralism are different. And talk of uncertainty is also perfectly consistent with realism, right? So you may think, no, there are objective truths about these things, but our ability to know them is constrained. That is what we typically think about, say, empirical truths, right? So you may think, there are truths of the matter about some goings on in some distant galaxy, but it's very hard for us to find out about it, right? Now there are interesting questions. Assume something like realism, but also accept at least some restricted kind of pluralism and also some epistemic modesty and with it uncertainty. How should we proceed? How should one make choices in the face of value pluralism? What should one do, in a phrase that is often used here? What ought one to do when one doesn't know what one ought to do, right? How should we make decisions in conditions of uncertainty? And there are philosophical discussions of all of these things. I have views on some of them, not on all, and I'm certainly not sure I can argue for them adequately. But these are considerations that I think it will be important. I mean, if you are feeding your AI with a decision procedure, which from what I gather, sometimes you do, but sometimes you don't, right? But if you are feeding your AI with a decision procedure, you will need answers to these questions as well. On the upside, it may be interesting not to feed them that answer and to see what they come up with. Mm-hmm. But you'll probably have to feed them with something, like maybe you'll have to feed them with just attitude to risk. If you do that, you haven't yet given them a full procedure of dealing with uncertainty, but you will have given them something that is likely to affect their attitude, their strategy of how to deal with uncertainty. So there's room for that. But again, not stuff I know enough about.
Yeah, AIs have got a propensity to be overconfident and maximize at the moment.
But that's presumably more an anecdote of the present, right? It's not a necessary term.
It may not be in the future, but it is something, a problem that people need to work on now.
Oh, I'm sure that's true.
So, look, could current or near-term systems be used to stress test our moral theories or uncover hidden inconsistencies akin to maybe, really good philosophical assistance and help refine our normative thinking?
Well, helping find out inconsistencies, if they're really inconsistencies in the strictest sense, these are something that you don't even need AI to do. You can have very simple software doing that. And that is important, although I suspect that, you're going to have to somehow discipline your different moral views and theories in a way that allows for consistency checking, right? So the question is about more complicated things than mere consistency, right? Things like maybe coherence relations in general and so on. So here I guess I would like to use maybe like one last distinction. Philosophers of science sometimes distinguish between the context of discovery and the context of justification. The context of justification is, how one justifies an empirical hypothesis. That's all of the discussions of the scientific methods are there in the context of justification. The context of discovery is how do you come up with the hypothesis initially? And typically philosophers of science have much less to say about that, right? And they're also much more liberal about that, right? So whatever works, right? So the first thing I want to say is that AI may very well be helpful as a part of the context of discovery. Suppose that what the system does is just raise these really interesting moral claims that we haven't thought about. And you use it as an insightful kind of hypothesis generator. That would be great, right? I mean, as long as it doesn't just generate infinitely many random ones, right? So just think, for instance, suppose that 100, 200, 300 years ago, such a system would come up with ideas in the vicinity of veganism. Well, that seems like, okay, that's once the idea is out there, it's worth serious consideration. But at that point, we don't treat the AI as authoritative in any way. We don't say, oh, the system's come up with it, so it must be true. But we're saying something like, here's a really interesting idea. We came across it, via consulting our friendly neighborhood AI system, but that's not a necessary feature of it. And then we still somehow subject it to the usual kind of normative discussions that we have in order to see whether it's justified or not, right? So that seems to me like a a wonderful role for AI, and not even the threatening one, right? The more threatening one, perhaps in some way the more theoretically challenging one, is in terms of the context of justification. So will it make it somehow, suppose an AI system comes up with a specific moral judgment. It doesn't tell you, here's something it's worth to consider. It tells you, here's a judgment that's true. Should we believe it? Just based on the AI's say-so. So here are some questions of opacity and explanations and so on again come into play. But there's also another thing, and that's possibly, well, I'm not sure it's unique to morality, but anyway, it's characteristic of morality and not of some other things, right? So if this AI system, which you have seen is extremely reliable on, say, some scientific question, comes up with a scientific claim, that should be a good reason to believe it, right? But it's not clear that the same is true of morality. So there's a question sometimes comes up in the literature in terms of questions about moral deference or moral expertise. There's the question whether you should ever accept a moral statement just based on the say-so of someone who's more reliable than you. And that is controversial. Myself, I think that sometimes, yes, you should accept a moral judgment just based on that. And then I think of the AI case as really just a particular instance of that case, right? So in our little hypothetical story, the AI system is just more reliable than you are on such matters. And I don't think you're entitled to ignore that.
Right. So yes, it could be the case that we need to epistemically defer to an AI, but we want to trust but verify. Yeah, I totally agree. Look, it's been amazing having you on the show.
The pleasure was mine.
Future. And look, if there's any concluding remarks that you have not yet said, but you think is worthy of dropping at the end of this discussion, and now's the chance.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure. We've covered a lot of grounds.
Yes, we certainly have. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, interesting stuff. Thanks again for having me. Really interesting stuff.
Oh, look, it's really cool. I'm following your stuff. It's been really interesting. Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been really great talking to you, and I really hope to do it again at some stage. Look, I look forward to hearing any more you have to say about AI, and I do encourage anybody who's engaged in philosophy who thinks that AI is having a large impact to get involved in the discussion, and
I can see the significance of that, of course.
Mm-hmm. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna.
Right. And thanks everybody for joining.